Okay, so now that we know where San Diego stands, let's talk about how do we make our workplaces safe so that we can try to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in our businesses and then ultimately in the community as well. So there are four key safety measures that I'm sure you've all seen before, but they cannot be stressed enough because these are our first defense against the spread of COVID-19. One thing that I want to emphasize here is that communicating these to your employees and making sure they know how to implement this is really important for making these safety measures effective. And then secondly, this is also important for your employees and customers to build trust so that they know that you're taking this seriously, and it builds confidence for consumers going to your business knowing that you're doing everything you can to keep them safe. So social distancing, 6 feet, we all know that. Part of the reason that this is super important is because when we're talking about an exposure in the workplace, so if someone has COVID-19 and we're trying to figure out who might have been exposed to that person, who needs to quarantine, we're going to be looking at who was a close contact. And the definition of a close contact is someone who is within 6 feet of an infected individual for a total of 15 minutes over a 24-hour period. So definitely making sure that your employees are social distancing as much as possible is important for minimizing the impact that a case of COVID-19 in your workplace could have. So some practical tips, you wanna make sure that this isn't just something that you tell people to do, but that you actually structure your workplace to encourage social distancing. So this is, through using physical barriers. Hopefully, many of you probably have acrylic shields between counters and workspaces. You want to be implementing that where you can to increase distance. Of course, using the tape on the floor to guide customers. A lot of businesses have found that using bright tape is especially important or helps people notice it more than if you use like blue. So that's a tip there. Designating separate employee workstations. You don't want employees to be sharing tools or sharing workspaces because then that encourages them to come closer together, and you want to avoid those situations as much as possible. And one thing that's really overlooked is break times. So for breaks, you want to avoid a situation where there are lots of employees in a small enclosed space with their masks off, eating, talking. That is like perfect conditions for COVID-19 to spread. So instead, you want to make sure that you're staggering break times so that employees aren't in the same space for their break at the same time, or even creating a new break space. If you can go maybe somewhere outside where there's more ventilation, or have extra rooms designated for breaks so that people are not together during the break, that's really important for making sure that we cover all our bases. And then finally, of course, reducing the number of employees in the workspace. Just de-densifying is a great way to encourage social distancing. So face masks. This has to be used in conjunction with social distancing and vice versa. Neither of these are 100% effective on their own. So that's why it's important to use both. One thing that I've noticed, since I do a lot of outreach to businesses where we go around and give them packets in person, and I've noticed that a lot of times people are kind of fatigued. They're not really wearing their masks as much anymore. And that's really bad. We want people to be still taking this just as seriously as at the start of the pandemic. One thing is, even if you're wearing your mask, it needs to be worn properly to be effective. And that means covering your nose and mouth. Wearing it under your nose might be more comfortable, but it's ultimately less effective. And of course, the most important times to wear your mask is when you're speaking, coughing, or sneezing. Ironically, I've seen people remove their mask to cough, which is definitely not the point. So make sure that you tell your employees to be aware of these things. As far as implementation, putting signs up, the state does require employers to either provide or reimburse reasonable expenses for masks because it is something that is necessary for the operation of a business. Now, I do want to mention some rare exceptions to the face mask rule. So there are certain medical conditions, and these are really rare, where they may not be able to use a face mask. If that is the case, you can use alternatives such as a face shield or a mask with a drape. One thing that you guys need to be careful of is There is apparently a fake medical exemption card going around where people claim that it's a card that means they don't need to wear a face mask. If an employee has a medical condition such that they cannot wear a face mask, you need to be asking for a physician's note. Um, and then another possible exception could be if the face mask would contribute to a workplace hazard. So this is mostly in industrial settings. For instance, if you're working with heavy machinery or with chemicals, certain chemicals, it might be a workplace hazard. Linked here is a website from Cal OSHA that kind of talks about some considerations. Again, this is mostly in industrial settings, and it's a rare exception. Most of the time, in most circumstances, employees should be wearing masks. Finally, sanitation. We all know high-touch surfaces. One thing that's really important, though, when you're disinfecting is you want to use an EPA-approved disinfectant, and this is for the safety of your employees. And another important tip is you want to ensure that you use the product correctly, and that includes leaving it on the surface for a certain period of time. In order for the disinfectant to actually kill pathogens, it has to be in contact with them for usually at least a minute, depending on the product. So linked here on the slide are resources that you can use to figure out what the proper length of time for your disinfectant is. So make sure that you're training your employees on contact time and how to use these properly and safely. And finally, hand washing. Again, this is one of those super basic but um, really important safety tips. And one thing I want to point out here is that gloves do not replace hand washing. So if you're using gloves, you still need to wash your hands before and after, and treat your gloves as though they're dirty. So that's something important to note for hand washing. And then finally, some best practices. One thing that's really important is employees need to be taking these precautions not just at work, but also at home. So it's really important that you make sure that your employees know why you're taking these precautions and how they should implement it when they leave the workplace, because that's important for making sure that we don't spread COVID-19 in the community or in the workplace. Another important tip that's often overlooked is discouraging carpooling. And this is kind of interesting. At the beginning of the pandemic, the meatpacking industry had a lot of issues with spread of COVID-19 among their employees. And so they implemented a lot of safety controls, like the ones that we just talked about, to try and minimize the spread in the workplace, but they were still having lots of infections. And they were able to trace it to carpooling. So try to discourage carpooling among your employees. If they do need to carpool, have them look at this California Department of Public Health guidance on ride sharing, linked on this slide. It just gives tips to try and minimize the risk of spreading infection while carpooling. And then finally, and really important, is promote the flu vaccination within your workplace. It's really important, since COVID and flu are going to be going around this season, to try and minimize the strain on the healthcare system. A flu vaccine will not prevent COVID, but it will prevent the flu, and we don't want the flu to be spreading around as much this season. Okay. A last quick tip is there are posters available from the county, so you can contact them if you would like free posters.